Thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate it. It's an honor to speak to you, and thank you for the Institute for having me. I'm going to proceed in 4 kind of steps or sections today. So my challenge is to communicate to you, hopefully clearly and concisely, a multitude of arguments in a booklet treatment in a rather summarized fashion. So I'm going to do it in 4 steps. The first is I'm going to kind of provide you some context and define what I mean by humanitarian action. And in doing so, I'm going to show you some trends, some graphs to demonstrate a point that I want to make, and I'll make that clear in a moment. Section 2, if you will, is about the limits of humanitarian action. So what can we actually accomplish? Section 3 is why there is a natural tendency to push beyond those limits, and then we'll close up with some implications, and we can talk about whatever it is that interests you, whether it's what I discuss here or other things that are of interest to you. So humanitarian action, what am I talking about? Well, when I undertook this project, at first what I was thinking was, okay, humanitarianism, we tend to think of little children starving. We tend to think of situations like Haiti, where there are natural disasters and people are injured and they have no food, no shelter, no health care. In other words, short-term type of crises. But as I started reading more and more into this, I realized that was too narrow a definition. Short-term assistance, handing a thirsty person a bottle of water, can quench their thirst in the short term, but then what happens tomorrow or next week? They end up in the same humanitarian crisis, the same situation where they are suffering. So very quickly I realized that humanitarianism, the way people talk about it, is a much broader notion. And so I want to just maintain a straightforward and broad concept, which is humanitarianism is a concern for the welfare of other people. Humanitarian action is the manifestation of humanitarianism. In other words, it is a array of efforts to improve the well-being or welfare of others. It can entail non-coercive type of activities. So for instance, after the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, the Haitian government, what was left of it, invited the U.S. and other governments to voluntarily come in and give them money. The U.S. offered aid, and the Haitian government said, you can come in. That was non-coercive. Coercive is something like Libya. Gaddafi did not invite the United States and other governments in. They coercively enforced a no-fly zone, which eventually led to his topple and death. That's an example of a coercive humanitarian action. Domestically, if you want to think of an example, think of Hurricane Katrina. There's an entire agency in the United States, FEMA, whose sole purpose is to respond to domestic humanitarian crises. That's a non-coercive example of non-coercive humanitarian action. You might notice that all the examples I gave entail states, governments, and so do these quotes. And here's the way people tend to think about it. I want you to think, you probably think about it these ways. You see people suffering and you say, we have to do something to help them. We have an obligation. And political leaders, both on the left and right, so this is a bipartisan type of way of framing the issue, and across time, right? So I have Kennedy all the way up to President Obama, is to say, look, the United States or the UK or whatever government, or the United Nations, if we're talking about international organizations, has a moral duty, a moral obligation to assist those in need. My purpose today is not to discount or to say that you should not care about normative or moral issues. In fact, I think they are quite important. But here's what I want to suggest to you. They are not all that's important, because wishing something is so, wanting something to be so, does not make it so. In other words, good intentions do not equal good results. What we need to take into account is the information that people have and the incentives they face. In other words, principles of microeconomics. So while economics, as a discipline, cannot tell us what we should do, that is the realm of ethics, which is why you should study that, economics can inform ethical decisions, because what might at first appear to have moral weight, it might at first say, yes, we should help people, we have an obligation, actually may have no moral weight once you take into account your ability to actually do it. Stated differently, what if you said to me, we have a moral obligation to help people in Syria right now? And I said, well, okay, but I can make an argument that actually trying to help them might make them worse off. Would you then say we're going to do it anyway? Hopefully not, if you truly care about the well-being of people. So all I'm suggesting is we need to take into account the ability, the positive ability as compared to the normative, what we ought to do, the positive ability to help other people. Economics can help inform those discussions, which in turn then can help inform moral discussions of humanitarian action and what is your obligation to do. So one of the things, hopefully, if you walk out of this room with nothing else, you won't just start saying things whenever you see something happening. We have to do something. We must do something to help them or else. No, that's not true. We only want to do something if we're going to actually help the people who are suffering. If we make them worse off, we want to refrain from undertaking that action. So here's the thing. Up until about World War I, humanitarianism was largely private. The state was still involved, but I'm talking about the nation state when I refer to the state. But there was a lot of private, ground-up type associations. They were smaller scale. And among other things, arguments were made that they couldn't scale up their operations. So the argument was, well, you needed government to do this. Then, of course, as the world became more interconnected and globalized, if you will, the argument was we need international organizations to maintain peace, to help people that are suffering. We got things like the United Nations after World War II, and those organizations now are heavily involved in humanitarian issues. I'm going to go through a few graphs here. Don't get caught up on any one graph. And I'm going to go through them relatively quickly because, in some sense, that's not my main point here today. The reason I'm showing you these graphs, this data, is to impress upon you that over time, these states or governments' involvement in humanitarian action has increased since the mid-1940s. Again, when I refer to states, I mean either individual nation states or groups of nation states together through international organizations like the United Nations. This is the UN regular budget. Now, the UN's a little confusing. They have 3 budgets. It gets a little tricky unless you actually read into it. And even after you read into it, it gets even more tricky. The regular budget is their normal operating budgets. So if you looked at this, you might say, okay, 4.8 billion. Actually, the UN's budget is something every 2 years. I'm going to come to this in a moment, about 20 billion. You say, what? That doesn't make sense. Well, there's 2 other budgets that aren't counted here. One's the peacekeeping budget for their peacekeeping operations, and the other is called extraordinary budgetary items, which are budgetary items that are approved in addition to this. Now, this graph is somewhat misleading because you see this jump up and you say, that's huge. But you'll notice something else on here. Starting in 72, or actually after 73, excuse me, you see 2 years per budgetary renewal. And that's because in 73, they switched to a biennial budget. So they passed a budget for every 2 years. But still, if you look at the increase in percentage terms, 400% prior, still increased by 140%. The UN budget has increased dramatically over time. This is partially capturing or representing the fact that the UN is involved in more activities than ever before internationally. This is the number of aid projects that are undertaken by countries that are associated with the OECD. DAC countries, Development Assistance Committees countries, which are basically the developed democracies in the world, if you want to think about it that way. You can see it's increasing dramatically. Now, here's something that should introduce some skepticism right away, and a critique of this. Prior to about here, these organizations didn't track the actual number of projects they were engaged in. Right away, you should say, what? They're spending millions of dollars and they don't even know. So if you had said to them, how many projects are you involved in and where's the money? And they'd say, I don't know. I can't tell you that. So what the people who put this data set together did, they looked back and tried to estimate. So one critique could be, well, this is overstating it because how confident can we be that there was like 5 projects going on in 1970 or whatever that is? Probably not that confident. But let's look here from 2000 to 2008. This is when aid transparency and accountability were at the forefront of aid discussions. So people were actually really paying attention to this stuff because they woke up one day and said, wait, aid's not working so well. Maybe we should actually track what's going on and try to figure out why. Even over this period here, you can see that the number of projects undertaken has more than doubled. So governments are doing more than ever to help people in need. This is ODA. ODA stands for Official Development Assistance. DAC, I mentioned, the Development Assistance Committee, which is a subgroup of the OECD countries. When you hear journalists or economists or policymakers refer to foreign aid, typically, not always, but typically they're referring to Official Development Assistance, ODA. Again, you can see it increasing over time. Peacekeeping. This is UN peacekeeping operations. This is showing you 2 things. This is the number of missions, all right, peacekeeping operations, and this is the number of personnel in hundreds of thousands. So if you take a look, the number of peacekeeping operations has pretty much stayed flat. The average is something like 16.8 or something per year. But the number of personnel has increased dramatically. again, this captures the fundamental point that peacekeeping operations are trying to do more than ever. And here's how this goes. Originally, peacekeepers were meant to keep the peace. What does that mean? Two people are fighting. They reach an agreement to stop fighting. What's the problem? It's what economists call a problem of credible commitment. How do I credibly commit that I'm not going to violate the agreement and punch you when you turn around and take your stuff? But if you know that that threat exists, what happens? You never entered into the agreement in the first place, which means you never get peace. So what happens? Well, it sounds logical. A third party, the United Nations, comes in and stands between the people with the gun. And they say, I'm going to prevent each of you from touching the other person. I will enforce the peace agreement. That was the initial idea behind peacekeeping, which is why now it's called traditional peacekeeping. Modern peacekeeping involves not just that, but nation building, rebuilding legal institutions, political institutions, economic institutions, resolving disputes, and so on. The array of activities that fall under the umbrella or guise of state-led humanitarian action has increased dramatically, and that's represented by the fact that there's more people involved in these missions. NGOs. NGOs stands for non-governmental organizations. As the name implies, they are not supposed to be part of the government. They are supposed to be non-profits, so they're not for-profit firms, they're non-profits that are privately run. The idea was originally that these would serve as an intermediary between markets and government. What happened over time is that government said, well, we're hearing good things about NGOs, we should start contracting with them. People say they have local knowledge, they're flexible, they're accountable, so let's start running our money through them. And they did. But here's what happens. The minute you start taking contracts from government, you are subject to a whole array of rules and regulations. And you might say that's very good because we want, after all, to keep them accountable with taxpayer money. That's not my point. My point is that when NGOs become linked in with government, what happens is they're no longer non-governmental. They're just another arm of government. In fact, in the post-9/11 period, with the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, an entirely new angle was introduced. NGOs became militarized. Andrew Natsios, who I'll mention again in a moment, who is the head of USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, Colin Powell, referred to NGOs as force multipliers, as part of the US Army efforts to overthrow insurgents and to achieve US ends. In other words, you saw the militarization of humanitarianism, where humanitarian practitioners were forced in many cases by members of the US government and other governments to follow the orders of the military, which, by the way, is fundamentally at odds at how humanitarians view the world. Humanitarian principles set out by the Red Cross and even before the Red Cross emphasize independence, neutrality. In other words, you don't judge people as being good or bad people. They're people. And so we help everyone. In other words, we help members of the Taliban if they're hurt because they're human beings. Of course, that is fundamentally at odds with the goals of the United States Army, which is to kill those people. So you can see how these things can be at odds. And typically, the military goals win out. So, assuming you followed me up to this point, which is basically saying, look, the states become more heavily involved over time, the next logical question is, well, how have they done? If they've done very well in helping people, we should celebrate. We should say this is great. Perhaps we should even spend more resources. And here's the thing. Like so many questions in economics, we don't have a firm answer. These are two development economists talking about Haiti. Basically, they say, look, this is one of the biggest efforts ever. Maybe we should know if it's good or bad, but guess what? We don't. Right? This is not just this, by the way. You might say, OK, we can resolve this question empirically. We'll run regressions. We'll look at the effect, for instance, of foreign aid on economic growth as measured through GDP. If foreign aid increases GDP, that's good. If it doesn't, then aid hasn't worked. Guess what? The empirical results on that are completely mixed. There's no consensus in economics on whether aid is good both for long-term development or for short-term relief. So where does this leave us? You might say, well, man, we're kind of stuck now. We can't use standard empirical techniques to resolve this because we have mixed conclusions. So what can we say? And I want to suggest that we can say a lot. Contrary to the cliche that people use, let the data speak, right? Just the facts kind of logic. What we actually need is theory. Theory can resolve many of the discussions, not with a firm answer, but by providing parameters on what we can actually accomplish. And you might say, well, wait, we need to test theory. Well, in order to test a theory, you need theory. All data is theory-laden by definition. If you don't understand this, think about it this way. In order to collect data, what do you need? A theory of what data is important. Because how else would you know what to collect? Unless you had a theory of what GDP was in the first place, how would you know what data to collect? Should we just randomly walk around and pick people's age and add that up? That's a number. No, we have specific things that we measure because we have a conceptual framework of what the notion of GDP entails. Likewise, theory can help us adjudicate between contrasting empirical findings. In other words, when we don't have a clear answer, theory can help us shed some light on what the parameters are of what we can accomplish. And here's what I want to suggest to you. An economics of humanitarianism, in other words, applying the economic way of thinking, principles of microeconomics, to humanitarianism can get us a long way in helping us understand some of these issues. So what I'd like to do now is turn to that. And I'll begin by talking about what the limits are. What can we actually accomplish in practice? Notice what many humanitarian practitioners and economists argue, and politicians. I'm sure you've all heard people say something like this. If we all gave $1 a day, we could end world hunger. If we just gave more foreign aid, we could help the poorest people in the world. What is this fundamentally assuming? It's assuming, first of all, that we have the knowledge, or someone has the knowledge of how to end poverty. And number two, that it's purely a resource constraint. In other words, if we just had more money, things would be different. So let's think about this. Let's think about the relevant issues. And in order to do that, I want to turn to this book by the economic journalist named Tim Hartford. It's a wonderful book, not just for humanitarianism, but for life in general. And let me give you a Cliff Note version of the Cliff Notes of ADAPT in 2 bullet points. This is the completely uncontroversial premise of this book. People are humans, they make mistakes. That's the premise of the book. We're all human beings and we are error prone. There's no way to avoid this. Given that, what ultimately drives success or failure is our ability to adapt to those mistakes. Forget, I'm going to be perfect and not make mistakes. Everyone does. Your ability to succeed is to make corrections in the face of errors. Hartford says, okay, what are the conditions under which people will be adaptable, or organizations, if you're running a business or a nonprofit or government or anything? Under what conditions will you be adaptable? And there's 2, and they're pretty straightforward. Number 1, people have to have the knowledge that they messed up. I made a mistake. I realize it. In other words, there's feedback mechanisms to alert you to the fact that you have erred. Number 2, you have to have an incentive to correct or change your behavior. If you don't know you made a mistake, you can't fix it because you don't know you did it. And even if you do know, if you don't have an incentive to correct it, you won't do it. You will have no incentive to change your behavior accordingly. It's a very straightforward framework, but it's quite powerful. So what I'd like to do now is spend a few moments applying these 2 kind of subcategories, if you will, to the notion of state-led humanitarianism. And let's start, we'll do them in order, so we'll do knowledge first. There's something called economic calculation or economic knowledge. And here's the thing, guys. The fundamental problem in economics is how to allocate scarce resources to their highest valued ends. We all have lots of stuff we want. We need to figure out how best to get it. But here's the thing. We have competing wants, both each of us. We all want more stuff than we can have. We all face constraints, whether it's time or physical resource constraints. And other people have ends that they want to achieve. We need to figure out how to allocate scarce resources accordingly. Should you do A or should you do B? Once you've decided to do A, what input should you use? If you have decided to make a desk, what should you use to make the legs of the desk, the top of the desk, and so on? You need a way to figure this out. That's what economic calculation is. Economic calculation is the ability of individual actors, whether they are entrepreneurs starting a business or just you and I acting on a daily basis, to allocate our scarce resources to their highest valued use. You don't want to misallocate resources. That's a mistake. If people want cell phones, we don't want resources being used to make desks. That's a misallocation of resources. The question is, how do we know that? So here's what I want to emphasize to you, which is really what Hayek, who's a Nobel Prize economist, who won in the 1970s, and he's well known for this article, The Use of Knowledge in Society. What Hayek's emphasizing is, look, economic knowledge is not given to people. It's not predetermined and given. We need to discover it every day. If you look at how entrepreneurs operate, what they need to do is they have a conjecture. In other words, I think, I don't know for sure, I think people will like this good or service. I think I can produce it for X amount, given the cost of inputs, and I think I can sell it for more. Are they always correct? Of course not. How do we know that? We see lots of businesses suffering losses and or going bankrupt, going out of business. That's a mistake. The entrepreneur has misjudged the opportunities that were in front of them. They've misjudged the way that people are going to react to them producing a good or service. That, by the way, is what? Knowledge. That's how we know what to produce and not to produce in the economy. That is what fundamentally drives economic dynamism. This is important. Why? The argument that if we have more money, we can end poverty assumes what? A person or group of people knows how to allocate money to maximize social value. They know exactly what people want. But think about your own life. Do you fill out some grand form at the beginning of each year and say, okay, this upcoming year, I need 2 pairs of shoes of this color, I need this many rolls of toilet paper, I need this many bars of soap, and then you submit the master list, and then it's produced and mailed to you? And of course not. What do? You wake up and you're like, oh man, I have no milk left. And then you go to the store. We're fortunate enough in the United States where we don't typically worry about shortages. We typically have lots of options. Should I get regular milk, chocolate milk? I don't know what to do. There's so many options here. I'm confused. Or now we can even go online and get it delivered because we're too lazy to get up and go to the supermarket. That's what economic development is. It is the link between production and consumption. Moreover, it is the production of all the complementary goods that go into things. Think about this. What if you bought a car, which is a complex output by itself, and it broke down and then there was no spare parts or trained mechanics to fix it? Would you just say, okay, I gotta get rid of that and go buy a new one? At some point, cars might be cheap enough where we can do that. We do that with other things, right? If our toaster breaks, we're like, all right, we can just go get a new one now. With cars, not so much. We take for granted the fact that there are millions of complementary parts out there and we can drop it off and people can fix it for us. Sometimes they have to wait a day or two while they're getting the parts shipped to them, but for the most part, no big deal. Think about any product or service that you enjoy like that, and you'll quickly realize that there are millions of components that go into it. That's what economists call complementary goods. They go together to produce the final consumer good that you and I enjoy. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, it's not. Again, you never even think about it. You take it for granted because you don't have to worry about it. That's the power of markets. Somehow, someone knows to produce, like a spare tire that people might want for their car, or maybe not, without you putting in any kind of central plan. It's there when you need it, or any other thing that you need. That's the power of markets. So how does this apply to humanitarianism? Well, let's think about it. Here's what assistance can do. Assistance, or aid, cannot solve the development problem. Economic development is not fundamentally an issue of spending more stuff. In fact, development involves spending less stuff. Wealth increases entails spending less resources to get either the same amount or more. Then you have leftover resources to buy even more stuff, right? When products become cheaper, you can purchase the product and have money left over to go buy more things for yourself. By things, I mean the broadest sense, not just material items. You have more money left over to donate to charity. You have more leisure time to donate to volunteering or your church or your friends or family, whatever it is that you value. That's wealth accumulation. What aid can do is increase a predetermined output, predetermined by either a bureaucrat working in a nonprofit or in government. You see a thirsty person, you say more water. You walk over to Walmart, buy a case of water, and walk over and hand it to them. Aid can do that. This is not shocking or amazing. It is spending more money on something and getting more stuff. This shouldn't sound shocking, but if you read many development reports, government bureaucrats love patting themselves on the back for purchasing that water and bringing it over there. They'll say things like, last year we increased the number of schools that were built. Last year we increased the number of children enrolled in schools. Last year we increased the number of bed nets that were sent around. These are not measures of development. These are measures of someone walking to a store, purchasing something, and bringing it over there. These are not impressive things. You and I do it all the time. Let me give you a concrete example. There's lots of people in the world that don't have health care. We worry about everyone having health care here. Let's put our issues aside. First world problems. Let's go to third world problems. Sounds simple enough. Let's send our leftover stuff, which we don't need anymore in the first world, over to them. Problem solved. Right? Someone's sitting in Washington, D.C., and they go, look, we don't need this garbage anymore. We'll send it over there, and they can use it. This is from The Atlantic in September. Right? And what happens? Exactly what I just told you. The machine breaks down, right, because it's old. They plug it in, and then it doesn't work. And they go, OK, let's fix it. And they go, wait, where are all those complementary goods Coyne talked about? Oh, we don't have them. Let me hire a mechanic to fix this. Oh, we don't have a technician that is trained to fix this, and they don't have the tools and parts anyway. OK, so now they can sit here and collect dust. Is this good or bad? By the way, aid has been spent. If you track aid by dollars spent, this would show up. Someone could say, success from last year, delivered healthcare devices to people, right? And they'd say, that's a success. And you'd say, well, your goal is to actually provide healthcare. This isn't doing it. And you might say, okay, nice example. You cherry-picked, good one-off example. And I say, no, not really, because the World Health Organization estimates that anywhere up to 70% of equipment just sits wasted. This is the fundamental difference between increases in outputs and development. It is true that in order to get development, you need to increase output. But you need to increase output that people value, consumers. Who the consumers value, not that some bureaucrat values so that they can check a box that they gave more stuff. It is helping the very people in need. What I want to suggest to you is that someone outside of the society does not have the relevant knowledge to plan economic development. This is what I call the outer limits of it. We should just recognize this. It's not good or bad, it's reality. These are hard facts. So let's stop pretending we can end poverty. Let's stop saying, okay, if you just give me enough money and enough smart people who have PhDs from MIT or Harvard or Princeton, we can finally solve the development problem. No, you can't. You can't solve it because you don't have the relevant knowledge. That's the outer boundaries of what we can accomplish. But what can we do? We can we can provide outputs to people. We can say, look, they're thirsty, we can hand them more water. They're homeless, we can provide them a tent or build them a shelter. We can do these things. This is technological or engineering knowledge. It does not require knowing the highest valued uses of resources. The resources still might end up wasted. I'll talk about that in a moment. But this is in principle possible. So it places firm limits, or it should encourage humility among those involved in humanitarian action. But here's the puzzle. Typically, state agencies say what? We can end poverty. No one says we can deliver water to people. They say, nope, we can deliver water and development and end poverty for good. So how do we explain this? Moreover, how do we explain the fact that this tends to happen? You walk into Walmart, you purchase a pallet of water, you walk over here, and by the time you get over to the person that's thirsty, it's no longer in your hands. It just disappeared. Or you got bashed over the head and someone took it. How do we explain that? Or a corrupt politician taxed you along the way. The tax happens to be a pallet of water. That's what we need to explain now. That's the puzzle. So in order to do this, we have to turn to politics. And here's fundamentally what you need to know. Nonprofits, whether they're private or government, act outside the context of markets. That's what a nonprofit means. By definition, they are not for-profit firms, which means political knowledge, knowledge generated through the political process, or in the case of a nonprofit, through the nonprofit process, replaces market knowledge. You need to figure out how to allocate scarce resources. It's what knowledge you're going to use to generate it. So what happens? Many people, humanitarians, by the way, hate markets for the delivery of humanitarian goods. And in some sense, you can at first blush see why. They say, look, markets are all about greed, about people making money, and people are suffering. You cannot put a price on that. You cannot say, look, okay, you're thirsty, you have to buy this bottle of water for me, and I can raise the price to whatever I want. On top of it, they'll point out, look, many of these people are poor, so they actually don't have the income to purchase things when they need to. They might also point out that there are a lack of well-functioning markets in those countries. So it's not like they can walk into a Walmart like you and I can. So they'll say, look, we can't use markets. And they'll say, well, we need politics. We need government to be involved. Why? Because while markets are narrowly focused on the self-interest of capitalists, government acts in the public interest. They are other-regarding. They care about other people. And so they say it removes kind of the dog-eat-dog cutthroat competition of markets. And what I'm here to tell you is no, it doesn't. It just changes the nature of competition. And if you've ever taken an economics class, this is not a controversial point. You know that competition pervades every aspect of your life because you can't be everywhere at once. You face scarcity. The fact that you chose to come here versus somewhere else, no matter what the reason behind it, means that you are competing within yourself, right? And this won out. Thank you very much. When it comes to government, what happens? You compete over scarce resources. Scarce resources still need to be allocated. The government announces we are spending $300 million on humanitarian relief. They have passed that. And we say, okay, who's going to get it now? Well, guess what? Lots of governments in poor countries come out of the woodwork and say, we need more money to help our poor people. Lots of agencies start arguing with each other. The Pentagon says, we need more money to fight insurgents that are keeping people poor, because after all, civil war is one of the leading causes of poverty. USAID comes in and says we need more money for field work to deliver goods and services to people and to build development programs and to execute those programs and so on. They start competing with each other. NGOs who are getting contracts from government start competing with each other. What do they need to do to secure a contract? They need to demonstrate that their humanitarian emergency is more important than the other guys. How do I do that? Well, you tend to exaggerate what you're going to do and how important it is in the scheme of the world. Then what happens? Private special interest groups come out of the woodwork because they want to get their hands in the bucket of money too. You have all these groups interacting. What's the one group of people that's not involved? The people that are suffering. The people that are actually suffering due to the humanitarian crisis. They have no say in this. They're voiceless. Think about it. Let's say you bring over, let's stick with Haiti. Let's say you're supposed to, the US government gives money, it's supposed to help in Haiti. Haitians have no way to voice their displeasure with the US government. And then for that information to be communicated back to you, who's the voter, who votes for your representatives that then are supposed to reflect your interests. That's in principle what democracy is supposed to do, right? You and I are the ultimate customers, if you will. You don't even know how much money the US has given to Haiti. I bet you if I asked maybe one or two of the political scientists, international relations type people might know. In any case, you understand the point here. Let me give you a very clear example. How many of you have heard of the Food for Peace program or Public Law 480? Has anyone heard of this? Just proved my point. How many know that the US Congress just passed a farm bill a couple weeks ago? Okay, you're making me nervous here about the future of the country. All right, all right. The Farm Bill, the Food for Peace or Public Law 480 is embedded in the Farm Bill. As the name implies, the purpose of this is to give food to promote peace. It was passed in 1954 under President Eisenhower. There, the reason it was passed is because the US government gave lots of subsidies to farmers. When people get subsidized, what do? Produce lots of food. We couldn't use the excess food, so the government started donating it abroad and said, see, the subsidies are great. We're helping poor people abroad. The farmers are propped up here. This is a win-win. It was actually changed or reformed under Kennedy. He said, look, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to change it around. He's actually the one that named it Food for Peace in the 60s. And here's what happens, okay? There's hungry people around the world. This is, by the way, the most straightforward case of what we can all tell what's wrong with it, and yet it doesn't get fixed. So let's check this out. Hungry people over there. We just need to deliver food to them. This bags of grain with USA written on it because, of course, need to commercialize what we're doing because we truly care about others. All right. All you gotta do is get this over there and give it to hungry people. Shouldn't be that hard, right? This would be the equivalent of you seeing a hungry person on the corner walking to a restaurant, purchasing it, and going, here, please eat this. That's an analog. That would be a local example. Here's how this works. Hungry people, give them food. What would logic dictate? Either give them money say, here's $10, go buy some food, because there are food markets in these countries, or we're going to send someone over to your country with $10, they're going to purchase the food for you and hand it to you. Not controversial or shocking. That seems like a good way to feed hungry people. Here's what happens in reality. Check this out. The United States sends food over from the United States, grown by US farmers on US ships, and it has to go all the way around the world. It's called tied aid. We give aid, but it's tied to US producers and US shippers. What's the problem with this? Well, if you're starving to death, typically you don't want to wait multiple weeks and or months to get food, especially when it's readily available. Talk about harming someone who's suffering. Imagine they're standing there. There's a operating food market there. All they need is money. And you're like, yeah, we'll just ship it around. Just hold off for a couple months and check out that food market. Admire that, because that's what's coming to you if you can hold out. That's what happens. It's absurd. It is patently absurd. Both Republicans and Democrats recognize this, by the way. It's not one side or the other. Yet it's been going on, and it continues without stop. Why? By the way, don't take my word for it. Remember I mentioned Andrew Natsios. He was the administrator of the United States Agency for International Development under George W. Bush. In other words, he ran the US Development Agency. I've run these operations. I knew food aid gets there after everyone's dead. He tried to get it reformed. Couldn't do it. Why? Well, we have starving people. They need food. They're the ones we're trying to help, assuming you care about other people. But who benefits from this program? You know who benefits from the program. US farmers and US shippers, and the people that pick up the food and put it on the ship. Those are the people that benefit. Don't take my word for it. Let's just turn right to them. After the Obama administration attempted to reform this, they sent a strongly worded letter to him, and we can access it. Growing, manufacturing, bagging, shipping, and transportation of nutritious. Notice they throw in words like nutritious, like there's no other nutritious food in the world. Creates jobs. Right there, you should raise a red flag. The goal of humanitarian aid is not to create jobs. It's to help starving and suffering people around the world. Economic activity at home. Provides support for the U.S. Merchant Marine, which is somehow national defense is entailed in this. I'm not sure how that involves grain, but it is. Sustains robust domestic constituency. Here's the key word. What does that mean? Special interest group. Special interest groups never say, look, I want this money for myself. What they say is, right, we need to maintain robust support. That just means we want you to do it or we're going to get mad at you, right, and not vote for you. Who suffers? Those people waiting in line for food, the very people we seek to help. Now, here's the thing I want you to keep in mind. If this happens with the simple delivery of food from point A to point B, what do you think happens when we say, okay, we're going to deliver food, rebuild a country's legal, economic, political systems, we're going to redo their courts, we're going to rebuild roads, and we just keep expanding the list of things we're going to do? Well, I think it's pretty safe to assume this gets multiplied by a magnitude. In other words, what happens is that more and more competition takes place over those scarce resources. What else happens? Well, again, governments and nonprofits are bureaucracy by definition. That means they're nonprofits. It's not good or bad. It's just what it is. There are certain incentives that are inherent in bureaucracy. In a firm, you are judged in terms of profit and loss. There is a residual claimant, an owner. If a residual claimant cuts costs, produces things that people value, that appears in the bottom line. They get to keep the money. That provides an incentive for them to what? Produce things people want at lower costs. If you work for a government agency, you're a civil servant who works for the public interest and your budget's $10 million and you spend $5 million and you go back to Congress at the end of the year and you say, I am a true civil servant, you gave me $10 million, I spent $5 million, I accomplished the end. What happens to you next year? Who knows? What?
You get $5 million?
Yeah, your budget gets cut. So what's the incentive? You spend everything, even if it's wasteful. It's basic economic logic, but it has important implications. What else happens? If you're judged on the size of your budget, what's the incentive? To do less or to do more? To promise that you can deliver water to people or to promise that you can end poverty if you just have a little more money and more smart people working for you? The latter. Again, guys, I am not making any judgment about the content of bureaucrats, by that I mean if they're good or bad people. The power of economics is I don't have to. All I need to do is make the assumption that people respond to incentives. If you make that assumption, you can explain pretty much all human behavior. All this is a application of that. I can give you lots and lots of examples. Katrina, bureaucracy. Don't take my word for it. Let's go to the US House of Representatives. Understand what happened. An entire government agency in the perhaps most developed government in the world, or one of the most developed governments in the world, by that I mean mature and functioning, its sole mission is to protect the domestic population from extreme natural disasters. You all know what happened in Hurricane Katrina, so I don't need to spend time talking about it. This is again in Katrina. You all, or hopefully you're familiar with the trailer debacle, right, where the United States government or FEMA purchased all these trailers and then they couldn't use them, right, and then they had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for them to sit there. Then, by the way, there was like formaldehyde in them or something, so then they got sued, or they sued the manufacturer, and now they've been destroyed, I think, or a lot of them have. Iraq, Afghanistan, can't keep track of the money. Again, don't take my word for it, just look it up. There's an auditor, Special Inspector General for the Iraq reconstruction and the Afghanistan reconstruction. They have websites, they publish all their reports. Their sole job is to audit these efforts. And you can just look through report after report and just find no one's keeping track of the money. Here's what you need to think about. Again, basic economics, guys. If you want someone to do something, what do? We teach like children this. You hold them accountable. You are responsible for the consequences of your action. If I can tax people, meaning I'm using your money, I pass it through 20 different bureaucratic layers, and then it gets lost over there, who's responsible at the end? We all are. That means no one is. Which means what? You get lots of waste. And I can keep providing you example after example. I could stand here for hours and just keep providing examples of this. I mentioned this at the outset. Most people think of humanitarianism as being kind, helping people. Lots of humanitarianism kills people, harms the very people it's intended to help. This is just the logic of unintended consequences, guys, which you all know from economics, also called secondary effects, which means when there's an intervention in a complex system, there's a direct effect, and then there are secondary effects. For those of you who have taken principles or intermediate, you'll remember examples like this with rent controls. Right? We talk about there being direct effects. There's a shortage of apartments, but there's also secondary effects. It provides a disincentive to invest in building subsequent housing. It provides an incentive for black market activity and so on. Those are the direct and indirect effects. Same logic. Complex systems are systems where there are interrelated elements and where the outcomes of those interrelated elements look different than any of the individual parts. A market is a complex system. There are millions of different people that are each pursuing their ends. All you care about is your own narrow end. You don't step back and look at the entire market, but if you do, so when you discuss these things in economics classes, when we marvel about things like, boy, look how many different pieces go into a number 2 pencil and then we can buy it for 3 cents. That's pretty amazing. That's us stepping back and talking about the outcomes of a complex system. Politics, economics, social life, those are all complex systems. We can contrast that with linear thinking. Linear thinking is engineering thinking. If you want to build a bridge, that is an engineering problem. You can go to school and learn how to do that. It requires certain types of materials. It entails the ability to gauge the type of weather that the area is subject to see if the bridge is going to hold up. There's lots of different bridge structures. I don't know what they are. My brothers are engineers. I hear them talking about them, so I know they exist. That's an engineering problem. Development is not an engineering problem, even though lots of people pretend it is. Just a couple examples of this, and then I'm going to give you an actual case study from the real world. If there's really bad political institutions in place, right? Let's combine two together. Very corrupt governments. And they say, we need money, US government, because we're corrupt. We need to reform. What do you expect to happen if you give a corrupt government millions of dollars? Well, most likely, it will get stolen. This should not be shocking or novel. Yet again, people are like, what? I can't believe that happened. That's amazing. In other words, you've reinforced the status quo. By the way, you have just made what? Economics, you have raised the wage of being corrupt. You have provided a return on investment, if you will. I mean, a return on developing skills of being corrupt rather than reforming. In cases where political institutions are not entrenched, Let's say a civil war is going on. You dump millions of dollars in the middle of it. What's going to happen? People are going to say, oh, thank you. Okay, let's shake hands and get along and split this up. Nope. I'm going to kill you so I can get the money. When you put money in the middle of an unstable situation, it promotes instability. Here's another interesting thing, and then I'll move on. When the United Nations goes into countries, they're not subject to the country's laws, which are typically non-existent or not enforced anyway. They are subject to their home country's laws. If you read about humanitarianism, humanitarians, it's in quotes here, because many of them, again, not all of them, commit crimes. That's stealing things. That is harming women and children. It's engaging in the sex trade, the child labor trade, and so on. You say, wait, Coyne, I thought you weren't making judgments about people, and you just pointed out people do bad things. I'm still not making judgments about them. All I'm saying is this. When there's no criminal law or when the cost of engaging in a behavior is lower, you get more of that behavior. In other words, all I'm doing is extending the logic of the law of demand. If you are not subject to laws which raise the price of a behavior, you engage in more of it. Precisely because humanitarians, in some sense, supposed humanitarians, are acting in a world of anarchy. They're not subject to those laws. Think about Blackwater. What happened with Blackwater in Iraq? They were granted immunity, right? So what happens when you're granted immunity? You're rewarded, the government rewards you for protecting their clients, members of the government. You can't be penalized for committing crimes. You shoot first, you ask questions later. So they kill a bunch of innocent people. Oops, can't try me, right? Of course, what happened then is everyone started blaming the market, which is kind of odd, because like, see, that's what happens when you have private firms involved. And it's like, well, not really. It's what happens when you have screwed up incentives. Bastiat's the seen and the unseen. Frederick Bastiat pointed out a very simple point. He said, look, really, this is also Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. Economics is the art of not just paying attention to the readily observable, what's in front of your face, but also the unseen, the chain of unintended consequences that emerge from actions. In other words, if you just look at the direct effects, you are stopping too soon. That's really what economics teaches you in some fundamental sense. Yet, when it comes to international relations, people pretend this isn't the case. Gaddafi, terrible person, horrible. Major human rights violations, even though the US government was his friend for a little bit a couple years ago, but let's put that one aside for sake of discussion. Let's overthrow him, or assist in overthrowing him. Seems obvious. That's the seen part. Get rid of a bad guy. What does an economist say? And then what? That's always the next question you ask. Then what happens? Well, now we have a natural experiment going on. Lots of innocent people are being killed because there is domestic chaos, a power vacuum, if you will. There was no government to replace Gaddafi's government. What else happened? Well, for those interested in international relations, you'll remember last summer, the French had a humanitarian intervention in Mali. Why? Well, because the US government helped overthrow Gaddafi. You say, what? How are those things related? Gaddafi was a bad guy, but he did a couple good things. There's a group called the Tuareg who live in northern Mali. They have been a thorn in the side of the Malian government for decades. They've been trying to overthrow them. Gaddafi brokered a peace deal. And here's what he did, being the bad guy he is. He said, look, I'll take them. They'll be my security force and keep my citizens in check. Right? They're thugs. So just send them over to Libya. They can live here. Their comparative advantages in thuggery, and I'll employ them as my security forces. He gave them really nice, fancy guns, and that's part of the group of people that were oppressing Libyan citizens. Gaddafi's going to fall. What did the Tuareg do? Oh my gosh, I better leave, or I'm going to get killed by the US and other governments and the militias that are running around. Start fighting the Malian government with the weapons supplied by Gaddafi. Those weapons, by the way, were also flowing into Syria. Because again, it's anarchy in Libya, basically. There's a fake government, but it can't broadcast its power. It can't actually maintain control of the country. The French had to intervene. Once you start thinking about these things, is the net benefit of overthrowing Gaddafi clear? I don't know. That's something that's up for discussion. But it's too simple to just look around and say, we need to do X because there's a bad guy or there's a bad situation, so we'll just do it. In other words, all I'm asking you is to take into account the fact that there are a long chain of consequences when you do things. So now we understand the outer limits. We can't plan development because we lack access to the relevant economic knowledge of how to do so. That shifts into the notion of political knowledge. The notion of political knowledge is simply that politics replaces that economic knowledge and leads to an array of perverse outcomes. And then we have system effects or unintended consequences that we need to take into account. Notice one other thing, guys. If governments are running this, we need to go back to our issue of adaptability. Unintended consequences happen all the time. They happen in private markets too. But here's what I want to suggest. Private actors tend to have the incentive to correct them where they incur. Politicians don't. Why? For all the reasons we just talked about. If you're a bureaucracy and you get more money by spending more money, and then there's waste going on, right? Or you're building things that people don't want, do you have an incentive to fix that? No, you don't. You actually have an incentive to perpetuate the problem. So in conclusion, and then we can open up and talk, here's what some of you are going to say to me. And here's what people say all the time. What should we do? We must do something. This is what everyone likes to say. And I want to say no, we don't. That's the answer to the question. We don't have to do something. We only want to do something if we are as confident as we can be that it's going to do good. And if you say, well, we can't be confident, then here's the next question you should ask yourself always. This goes for life in general. Are the rules in place for the system to be adaptable? Do people have the relevant knowledge or feedback when they make a mistake, and do they have an incentive to fix it? You ask yourself that no matter what walk of life you're in, you will do well because you will be adaptable. So that's the question you should ask, right? Someone says, we must intervene in Syria. Well, do you know how we should intervene, what type of intervention, what the consequence? They'll say, no, I don't know. Well, then why should I be confident? What feedback mechanisms are in place? What incentive do the relevant actors have to change their behavior if mistakes are made? That's the questions that economists ask. Here's the thing. One of the hardest things for economists to communicate to people is this idea of what we call spontaneous order. The idea that lots of great stuff in life, in fact, what makes the world go around, is not centrally planned. It is emergent in nature. Millions of individuals, including yourself and me as well, act purposefully. But our actions generate an order that is broader, that is greater than any of the constituent parts. That order is not planned. If you're confused by this, think back to my example with the master list in the market. The market is a perfect example of a spontaneous order. So are political systems. If you're confused by this, let me give you a basic example. What if I said this? I don't know why we went into Iraq and Afghanistan, or why we're talking about Syria. I have an easy fix. The US Constitution, well, it worked pretty good for a while at least. It's kind of short. I can go down to the museum shop and buy a nice deluxe version on parchment paper for 15 bucks. Buy it, roll it up, mail it over to Syria and say, hey guys, just follow this. If you just follow it like we did, you'll get at least a couple hundred years of good stuff. After that, questionable, but... And you'd say, that's ridiculous. And I'd say, why? And hopefully you'd realize part of what makes a rules function is the traditions, the history, the underlying cultures and belief systems which underpin them, which is precisely why constitutions, where they work, oftentimes they don't need to write down every single scenario in the world. That's why the US Constitution is short, right? It doesn't specify every single scenario. It provides general rules which people are supposed to follow. No one is in charge of complex systems. You're still going to have the urge to want to fix it and do something. I urge you not to. You say, why? And I say, because if you do, you're very similar to this. All right, just take a second and read this. Unconstrained thinking is the idea that you have the ability to fix the world around you. This is unconstrained thinking. This is the US ambassador to Haiti. Take in for a moment how obnoxious this is on multiple margins. The treatment of people like they are puzzle pieces. These are humans, by the way, let's keep that in mind. It's true they live in a different geographic location, but they are still humans. And the idea is that we are smart enough, by we I mean members of the US government, to put them together the way we want to. Like it's a 6th grade science project. This is the myth of the man in charge. When you believe in the unconstrained vision that we can do whatever we want, we can perfect man as long as we have enough resources and smart enough people. And if you fail, it's not because of limits on your own abilities, it's because you got screwed over because you didn't have the right people and the right amount of money. That's what you fall prey to. This is fundamentally what that position entails. What I want to suggest in contrast is what I call the unconstrained vision. The unconstrained vision is this. Appreciate that we're all human beings, which means by definition we're imperfect. Getting a PhD does not grant you permission to design the world according to your wishes. In fact, perhaps the most dangerous people in the world are people with PhDs, because they have some kind of fake legitimacy that they know things that they actually don't. And people listen to them and say, boy, they have a PhD, they must know what they're talking about, right? Nope. Most of the time they don't. But it pays well to pretend that you do, right? People respond to incentives, including economists. Go figure. Okay, so what's the constrained vision? It's an appreciation of the fact that development is a discovery process. It's people experimenting. It's people making mistakes. It's recognizing that mistakes are not a bad thing. They're part of life. It's how you rebound from those mistakes and correct your behaviors that will determine how successful you are. It goes for your own individual life, but for societies as well, which leads to a focus on the rules, and the rules that then create an adaptable system or don't. What else? This kind of thinking, which dominates humanitarianism, by the way. There's those people over there that are poor. There's us over here that are enlightened. We need to fix them. That is an outward orientation. Right? This is the idea of American exceptionalism. We're somehow above everyone else, and we can fix them. Well, in addition to being obnoxious, there's another problem with this. It's hard to do for the reasons I've pointed out. But if you truly care about people, if you truly are a humanitarian, in other words, if you're not just saying it because it's cheap to say, cheap talk, there's lots you can do. We can focus inward. Let me ask you this. What can we do domestically within the United States, where I'm assuming that many, if not all of you, are voters here? What can we do as citizens to help people in need? And what I want to suggest is there's lots of things we can do. Here are some examples. We can get rid of tied aid. We can get rid of agricultural subsidies. We can get rid of trade barriers which prevent people from bringing goods and services into this country. More radically, we can let people move here. We can allow for the free movement of individuals. Word individuals emphasized, because they are people too. We can stop pretending that geographic borders somehow differentiate people other than the fact that they happen to be born one place or the other. Now, you might say, look, well, I'm guessing many of you are saying you're crazy for recommending that. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But you also might say this, what about short-term crises? Even if this leads to long-term development, what about short-term crises? Well, guess what? Following the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, we had a great natural experiment. There were 200,000 Haitians here whose papers expired. They were illegal. The US government said, look, we can't send these people home because their country just got destroyed. We're going to let them stay here and give them temporary working papers. Those individuals sent home, the World Bank estimates, $360 million in remittances, which are transfers from the country that a migrant is working in to their home country in the year 2010. This is more aid from 200,000 people than the US government gave to Haiti in that same year. Imagine what could happen if we increase that number. We can talk about the immigration issue more during Q&A, but what I want to emphasize to you is there's lots of stuff you as US citizens and the US government can do right here without having to go abroad and try to move the world like puppet masters. Now, hopefully you're saying something like this. You just pointed out to us why the Food for Peace program can't be reformed. Why would we ever get these reforms? And in the short run, I don't think we will. But this, to me, is not an argument for doing more stuff. It's an argument for doing less, right? For saying, look, if we can't remove trade barriers domestically, what makes you think you can go abroad where there's numerous more layers of constraints and then say, look, I'm going to somehow circumvent those, right? Because now you're involving other governments, you're involving the United Nations and lots of other international organizations, which just increase the number of vested interests. So to the extent you are skeptical of this, likewise, you should be skeptical of foreign interventions more generally. The fundamental point here is that a more limited view, a more humble view of what we can accomplish can actually go a really far way in both making people better off, but perhaps more importantly, not harming them when they're already suffering. So with that, I'll stop and we can talk about whatever it is that you want to talk about, if there are any questions.